Welcome everybody to yet another In Conversation series by the RSM. You've got me, Roger Kirby, as the host tonight, and I've got an amazing guest, Lloyd Grossman, celebrity, cook, musician, writer, supporter of the arts and heritage, quite an extraordinary CV and amazing career. Welcome, Lloyd. It's lovely to have you on our show. I'm going to start off by showing everybody a copy of your latest book, which I picked up in Daunt Books, autographed copy, I was pleased to see. It's called An Elephant in Rome by Lloyd Grossman, and I'm going to read out from the passage from the back cover from Simon Jenkins, another extraordinary individual. An Elephant in Rome is a total delight, a brilliant vignette of the 17th century Rome, the Baroque and the Catholic Church, warts and all, rolled into an erudite narrative. It brings to life the relationship between a genius and his patron with an ease of writing that's rare in art history. And I completely agree with that description. So, Lloyd, tell us a little bit about your book and how you sat down and actually wrote it.
Well, it developed out of my very long love affair with Rome, and I have endless curiosity. When I look at something that's interesting, I always wanted to find out everything that I can about it. And one of the strangest things in Rome is this very large statue of an elephant in the middle of a small Roman square. The first time I saw it, I was absolutely enchanted by it because it's very beautiful and it's also very witty. It's quite a humorous statue. And I thought, what the heck is the statue of an elephant doing in a square in Rome? Why do you make a statue of an elephant to commemorate a pope? And that led me on a very, very, very long trail, which helped me to understand why Rome looks the way it does, how Rome developed as a city, and culminated in this book after quite a few years of sometimes pretty arcane scholarship and research.
Yeah, well, as I was saying before, you know, this program is watched by a lot of doctors, a lot of non-doctors as well, and I bet some people watching would love to sit down and write a book. You know, they've got so many stories of their work and their lives. So, tell us, you know, the process. I mean, how many hours of research and how do you actually put it together, make it happen?
Well, I mean, it happens. I love doing research. I absolutely adore research. So research is pure pleasure for me. And I rather suspect that a lot of medical men and women like doing research as well. They certainly seem to spend a lot of time reading peer-reviewed papers in various journals. So research is a joy. And of course, one bit of research always leads you to another. You know, I love footnotes and I love tracing footnotes. And as one academic once said to me, you know, always look at the footnotes because the footnotes to a book are like the roots of a tree. They're what feed the book, and they'll also help you to find out how the book originated. So I love studying footnotes. I love research. When it comes to writing, it's actually extraordinarily simple. You know, it is the old Nike slogan, just do it. And it is that thing of overcoming the fear of the blank page or the blank screen. But most importantly, and this is particularly relevant to very busy people like clinicians and practitioners, the most important thing is to carve out time to do it. So when I've had to, you know, really, really put a lot of graft into getting a manuscript together, I will put usually 3 to 4 hours every morning, 5 days a week, until I get it done. And this means, you know, moving a lot of things around and telling people you can't do things and making sure you finish your breakfast in time and all of that stuff. But it's putting the time into it. The hard bit is finding the time. Once you find the time, you just sit down and you write and write and write and rewrite and write again.
Yeah, Ken. We had Ken Follett on this program. He's a best-selling author, of course, and he was saying, rewriting is really important. Just the first draft, second draft, third draft. I mean, do you find that you go back, you do it again and again, or are you pretty happy with your first draft?
I usually do. I mean, the rule of thumb tends to be, what some people follow and others don't, is that the first draft is always rubbish. And it's just a way of helping you organize your thoughts. Everyone does things differently. Some writers do incredibly carefully plotted out outlines where virtually every aspect of the book is preordained. I do a fairly basic outline. I'm actually beginning to feel that I'm getting to be sort of competent at this. I've reached a level of competence. I do a fairly simple outline just to keep me on track, just to have a destination. And then I write, rewrite, rearrange, show it to someone else to read, move bits around. I like the editing process. I like self-editing. The most important thing is to tell a story and to tell it clearly. It doesn't matter to me whether it's fiction or nonfiction. There's got to be a story. There has to be a plot. There has to be excitement. There have to be interesting characters. If you, Roger, are going to sit down and write your memoir, the most important thing is that you're an interesting character. And you have to show people how interesting you are, and you have to show them in a way that they can actually understand. So the craft of writing, I think to a great extent, is the craft of explaining something clearly, having a great story to tell. The story is really important. If there's not a great story, why bother reading it?
Well, yeah, as I've already said, Simon Jenkins says you have an ease of writing that is rare in art history. And you and I share a birthday, a birth year, 1950, and we also I did a year of history of art at Cambridge University. I think you did your PhD there, so you must have like 2 or 3 years there with Professor Jaffe and Vivian Spate, Virginia Spate, and so on and so forth. So tell us about those kind of Cambridge days in the heady 1970s when the miners were on strike and Ted Heath was in charge, etc.
Oh, those were the days. I mean, interestingly enough, I very much deferred my postgraduate work. I'm a sort of serial student. So when I came over to London in 1974 to do a postgraduate degree at the London School of Economics, and of course I was astonished by arriving at this great city I'd heard so much about. And it was in the midst of a 3-day week. It was in the midst of an IRA bombing campaign. It was all looking very tired and shabby and depressing. But, I loved London. I loved being at the LSE. It was an extraordinary time. The great Ralph Dahrendorf had just become director there. There were a lot of very stimulating and exciting people. And the intention was that I should then go back to America, do a PhD, and become an academic. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. So I thought, because, typical, there was a love story involved, so I decided to stay in England. And someone said, well, why don't you go to Cambridge, do a PhD at Cambridge? And I had a supervisor all lined up, et cetera, et cetera. And then, miraculously, for no particular reason, someone came along and offered me a job. And the job was on a very glamorous, glossy magazine called Harper's and Queen. It was paying the sort of phenomenal sum of £8,088 a year, with invitations to lots of glamorous parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for some reason, I decided to do that rather than do my PhD. So the PhD was deferred for many, many years. And I really only got back to my PhD I think I started it about 12 years ago. So I arrived in Cambridge, firstly to do an MPhil and secondly to do a PhD as a mature student. And it was an incredible experience. It was an absolutely brilliant experience. I was in a wonderful college, Magdalen, which is very small, very beautiful, very collegial college. Met some wonderful people. It was inspiring to be working with young people. to teach. I got a chance to teach, which was wonderful. I was doing a lot of supervision of undergraduates. And it was altogether a thoroughly delightful experience. I fear now, though, that I have run out of education, because once you've got your PhD, unless you're German, there's no point in getting a second one.
Well, tell us about Harper's and Queen, because the magazine world in the 1970s must have been a load of fun as well.
Yes, with which you're very well acquainted, because your wife was already, I think, on her way to being a very high-powered editor at that stage, when I was merely a lowly hack. It was fascinating. Harper's and Queen was going through this period where it was kind of the most fashionable, glossy magazine in the world. They were very good at trend spotting. They had just come up with this phenomenon called the Sloane Ranger. So they were writing a lot about Sloane Rangers. And it was the first magazine to really talk about foodies, always doing lots of trend spotting. I had wonderful colleagues there, particularly Nicholas Coleridge, who went on to become president of Condé Nast, and a very distinguished writer and journalist as well. Lots of exciting people there. And one felt really in the midst of, if not the swinging 60s, which I missed because I was in America, certainly the almost as swinging late 70s and early 80s. And it was an extraordinarily good education in writing, because I and some of my fellow hacks used to sit in a rather dismal room, which we called the junior common room, and we would just churn out copy. There was one month where I was the gardening correspondent, the restaurant critic, the architectural writer, and also wrote another feature. So there were times when I was just churning out stuff under various pseudonyms, and it really taught one to deliver. It was fascinating.
And you were design editor, but you did all this other stuff as well.
Yeah. Because, like all magazines, it was, we always felt sort of perpetually understaffed and underfunded, although within the context of what happens in magazines today, we were rolling in the lap of luxury. The editor, we had a brilliant editor who opened bottles of champagne at 5 o'clock every Friday afternoon. It was a great, very, very privileged existence. And I learned a heck of a lot, because I really knew very little about how to put a magazine together. When I was a teenager in the States, I'd started writing mostly about music. So I was one of the early generation of writers for Rolling Stone. And I wrote for a lot of these very pretentious American underground publications, things with titles like the New York Review of Rock, or Vibrations, subtitled The Journal of the Rock and Roll Zeitgeist. So I was writing a lot of, pretty pretentious new journalism type stuff. But it wasn't really until I got to work for Harper's that I understood the real sort of professionalism of writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll come back to the rock and roll scene, because I know you're very involved in that. But sticking with the journalism, you went from Harper's to the Sunday Times, right? And
yeah.
Was Frank Giles the editor before he handed over to Andrew Neil? Was that right?
No, I went to the Sunday Times. I have to say that the excitement of the glossy magazine world faded away pretty quickly for me. And because I'm, wasn't really a fashionista, and I wanted to write for something with a more general appeal. And someone said, "Oh, why don't you go to the Sunday Times?" So I went to the Sunday Times, and Andrew Neil made me a contributing editor at the Sunday Times. Had a great time at the Sunday Times, covering a whole range of things, writing about a whole range of things, including getting to interview ZZ Top, bringing rock back into it. And I stayed with the Sunday Times, I think, for only about 2 years, when I was then sort of diverted and went off to work in television.
Yeah, and then the newspaper business. I mean, Andrew Neil must have been quite an inspirational guy to work with, wasn't he?
Yeah, yeah. Andrew was
a bit difficult.
You know, he kind of, I think largely because I was so unimportant, he was never really pulling my chain for any particular reason.
Right.
But I mean, it was kind of interesting because he arrived, you know, he was kind of an unknown quantity. He turned out to be a brilliant editor. And of course, subsequently, he's become a really extraordinary political broadcaster. I mean, it's certainly one of the best this country has produced for decades, I think. But I was kind of pretty much left alone. I had my own little team. I had a team of about 5, and no one really noticed us very much, as long as we provided enough copy.
Yeah. Well, what about the rock and roll scene? Because I'll just see if I can play this. I don't know whether anybody can hear that. So that was, tell us about that song and tell us about your rock and roll roots, and you're still playing that old guitar of yours, right?
Oh yeah. I have rather too many guitars at the moment. Unlike you, who lives in a Zen Japanese type uncluttered environment, I am surrounded by guitars and guitar cases. No, what we were just listening to was "Living the Past" by Jethro Tull, and I think that was probably recorded, I think, around 1969. I first saw Jethro Tull in 1969 in Boston at a very groovy place called the Boston Tea Party. Enjoyed them so much that I saw them 3 or 4 nights in a row. So that was 1969. Fast forward 46 years later, and discovered of historic churches. And I, at this time, am chairman of this wonderful outfit called the Churches Conservation Trust. So, and the original Jethro Tull, who of course was an 18th century agricultural pioneer, is buried in the churchyard of one of the Churches Conservation Trust churches. So Ian and I get into correspondence, and he says, "I hear you play guitar. Why don't you come and play with the band?" So I show up and I play with them because every year Jethro Tull plays 3 benefit concerts at 3 different English cathedrals to raise money for the cathedrals. And for the last 6 years, I've been playing 3 gigs a year with Jethro Tull. And then we get people like Hugh Cornwell and Mark Almond, all sorts of people come as guest artists. And for me, I mean, it's the most extraordinary thing to be standing on stage playing with these giants of rock who I have admired now for 50 years.
Well, your lead guitarist, I guess, or?
Well, no guitarist will admit to being anything other than a lead guitarist. You know, that's what you know, that's, I mean, you know, guitarists are, it's unusual to find a guitarist who's very self-effacing. So all guitarists are lead guitarists. Yeah, I'm a pretty poor lead guitarist, is how I would characterize myself. Although thanks to lockdown, I'm getting better. I now, after playing the guitar since 1962, I now actually understand the difference between a major and a minor pentatonic scale. Who knows what the next 50 years will bring, what improvements they will bring to my playing.
Yeah. Well, there's a question from Roger Lewis. He says, your guitar, it's a strange looking sort of thing with a classical headstock. What's the story behind your guitar?
Oh, that guitar, that's a really sort of interesting and observant question. That headstock is very decorative, but completely impractical. It drives me absolutely crazy. It takes forever to change the strings. It's a very, very beautiful guitar called a B&G Little Sister. made in Israel by these two sort of Israeli boffins who decided to create, the world's greatest guitar. It is a fabulous guitar, but it's not one of my, it's really not one of my mainstay guitars. I don't actually play it very often, although it's very beautifully made. It's not really my main axe, as we rock musicians say. But yeah, it does have this very weird headstock, which I think is decorative but useless.
You had your own band, New Forbidden, is that right? And have you played at Glastonbury a few times, is that right?
Yeah, we have played the New Forbidden, and we're still at it. Have played at Glastonbury 8 times. I hesitate to say, for those of you who've been to Glastonbury, because I know the RSM is full of Glastonbury going headbangers and pogoers. For those of you who have been to Glastonbury and not seen us perform, I have to say, no, we have never been on the Pyramid stage.
But it's actually, I don't go to Glastonbury. My daughter hangs out down there with your daughter's boyfriend. I think there's a group of them that go down there, and they have an amazing time. So it must have been fun for you to perform on that stage with all those people waving their arms around in front of you. Bit exciting, yeah.
Oh, it's great because I am accustomed in my band. I mean, it's not like, I'm trying to think, is there a medical analogy? Yes, but you're about to go into surgery and suddenly you find out there's no patient. When you play in a band like I do, you often show up at gigs and find that there is no audience. And I remember being booked to play a gig in Northeast London, and the promoter rang us up the night before the gig and said, "We are so excited because the music correspondent from The Guardian is coming tomorrow to listen to you." So the band and I got really, really, really excited. We arrived at this gig and there were 3 people in the audience, but we played our set. And then we went backstage to our less than luxurious dressing room, and there was a knock on the door, and the promoter said, "Are you ready? Because the music critic from The Guardian is here to interview you." We got so excited, and he came in and introduced himself as the music critic from the Walthamstow Guardian. So I'm used to playing to very, very small audiences. So Glastonbury makes a big difference.
Actually, because this program is interactive, Peter Wisniewski is asking about the picture behind you, which is kind of going in and out of focus. Just move aside. Describe that painting on the wall behind you.
Can't really, because it belongs to my other half.
All right.
And she's busy preparing a roast lamb at the moment.
Oh my God, that sounds great. Okay, well, let's talk a bit about your TV career, because that all kicked off in the 90s, is that right? And or a little bit before?
Actually, I think actually in 1982, I was surprised to receive a phone call from a very nice woman who said that she was a producer for a television station called TVAM, which had yet to TVAM was the first commercial morning station in the UK. She said, "I'm with TVAM. We'd love to talk to you about appearing on television."
Right.
Which I thought was, was kind of out of the blue. But my default position is usually to say yes to things and then try to figure out whether it's going to be any good or not. So I went for this interview, and they were very enthusiastic. They said, "Yes, we've heard so much about you. We really would like you to come up with some ideas for programs." And I thought, gosh, this is absolutely amazing. And I got in a room with David Frost, which was rather fascinating because David Frost was close to the most famous broadcaster in the world at that stage. And David and another producer and I came up with the idea for a television program, which subsequently became something called Through the Keyhole, which was very successful. But
tell us a little bit about that, because that is an amazing set of programs, wasn't it? You were you kind of got into people's homes and interviewed them and got the background. Is that right? Tell us about it.
Yeah. You went into someone's house without revealing whose house it was. And based on what the house looked like, you created a sort of guessing game. Namely, oh, this person has a lot of this particular book. They have this particular type of furniture, wallpaper, et cetera, et cetera. Who could it be? And, you know, the great catchphrase was, who lives in a house like this? And we went from TVAM to ITV Primetime, and for quite a while it was the most popular light entertainment show in the UK. It was broadcast on Friday nights, and we had, you know, like 10.5 million people watching it. Wow. And, you know, this was kind of interesting because I knew nothing about television. I said, a couple of years after I was recruited to create this program, I said to the producer who hired me, I said, how did you choose me? And she said, well, actually it was a bit of a mistake. And I said, what do you mean? And she then told me the story. And the story was they were having a brainstorming session looking for new talent. And someone said, oh, there's this guy who writes for one of the fashion magazines who's very witty, and we should hire him. And someone said, well, who is he? And they said, I can't remember his name. He has this really, really stupid name. and someone said, oh, it must be Lloyd Grossman. And they said, yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah, get him, get hold of him. They didn't want me at all. They wanted someone who wrote for Vogue, who was called Bevis Hillier.
So that's your climb to fame on the TV program. Started with wow, serendipity.
Hey, serendipity is a good. Never underestimate the power of serendipity.
Absolutely. And then tell us about MasterChef, because I guess that's what you're most famous for. Well, yeah, I mean, you're famous for loads of things, but that was a very popular program.
Yeah, I was in the, I suppose by the late 80s, I was doing quite a lot of television programs. So I was doing like a real mass market stuff, like Through the Keyhole with ITV. And then I was also doing a very good, very interesting program called Behind the Headlines with Robert Robinson for the BBC, which was kind of a newsy type, you know, more highbrow program. I was writing quite a lot about food at that stage, quite a lot about food. And I was rung up and asked if I would come and talk to some producers about a new program they were putting together called MasterChef. And I guess I was a pretty obvious person to do that. What appealed to me about it was that it was the first program to really, in a serious way, combine light entertainment with some serious food credentials. Because before MasterChef, most food programs were either just about cooking, namely, I don't know, Fanny Craddock.
Yeah, I remember her.
Or the great, you know, the sainted, wonderful Delia Smith, who is still very hard to beat, or Graham Carr. They were either about showing you how to cook, or they were incredibly worthy, you know, and they were aimed at hardcore foodies. Through the Keyhole was aimed at, MasterChef was aimed at a mass audience, but it was still serious about food. And so it was first broadcast in 1990. The BBC were not that excited about it. One BBC producer said to me, well, it's a terrible idea. Who would want to watch other people eat? You know, that's a typical creative BBC producer. So we were put out, when the show first went out, it was broadcast on a Monday night opposite Coronation Street, which was like the kiss of death. But we survived. We got a great audience. We were then moved to the tea time slot on Sundays, which is a great slot. And I was fortunate enough to present MasterChef for 10 years.
Wow.
From 1990 to 2000. Subsequently, it had a bit of a rest, and then they changed the format. They made it it's become a much more competitive program. It was quite sort of gentle when I was doing it, but television changes and people's expectations change. So unsurprisingly, it's become edgier. It's hugely, unbelievably successful. And, you know, I'm really so happy that I was part of the team that, you know, started it, what is now 30 years ago.
Yeah. And is that where you invented your famous sauces? One of our production people actually said they ate one of your sauces a couple of nights ago and it was delicious.
I'm very grateful to them. I didn't realize I had any relatives working on your production side. You know, what the sauces were something I always wanted to do, because we had way back in my family, there's a family background in food manufacturing, food industry. I always wanted to do that. I love Italian food. I'm devoted to Italian food. And I wanted to figure out a way to make sauces, because I didn't find anything on the market at that stage that I thought was good enough. So I kind of figured out how to do it. And what surprised me, and I got a friend had a sort of redundant sauce factory in, I think it was in Lowestoft. And I said to him, can I borrow the factory for 6 months and try to figure out what to do? So I did. What surprised me, I very naively thought that everyone who worked in the food business was crazy about food. And I soon found out that because the food business, you know, in many ways is about production, a lot of people who work in the food business, you know, are interested in engineering. So when I gave my first recipes to the factory, very excitedly, the factory manager rang me up about a month later and said, we have the first products, brought them to London. We had this big tasting. I tasted it, and it was absolutely dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. And I said, what did you do? He said, well, we followed your recipe exactly. And then he thought for a minute and he said, oh, but we used water instead of olive oil. So I said, why did you do that? And he said, well, you know, olive oil tends to clog up the fillers and it's all sticky and messy, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and instead of crushed tomatoes, we use tomato puree. And instead, you know, so there are all these things that I had to teach them how to do, because I was making it from the angle of someone who loved food and kind of thinks he sort of knows what food should taste like. So it was it was an incredible learning curve for me, and quite a learning curve for them as well. And, you know, that was 25 years ago. Unfortunately, the business has gone from strength to strength since then. And I still, you know, judge it by what I would cook and what I want to eat.
Our audience better go out there and pick up these sauces and taste them for themselves. Because, yeah, if I'm honest, I haven't tried them, but Maddie says they are just the best. So we better believe Maddie. But I know that you had a bit of a brush with the National Health Service in trying to get the NHS to come up with, maybe you're trying to flog them some of your sauces. Tell us about that.
Well, it was absolutely fascinating. I can't even remember who the health secretary was at the time. I think it was around 2001, 2002. And someone said to me, look, will you help the National Health Service improve the standard of hospital catering? So I said, yeah, of course. But by the way, you know, what you should know is that I am in no way a chef. I am in no way a catering professional. I know all these people. And one thing I do know is, you know, I know kind of how non-departmental bodies work. I kind of know how government work. I'd had a lot of experience working with quangos, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew my way around. So we put together this thing called the Better Hospital Food Panel, and I got lots of really interesting, serious chefs to work on recipe developments, et cetera, et cetera. There were three problems. Number one, there was no money. So there was, yeah, because at first they said to me, and this is, you know, a typical way, you know how governments are always announcing these huge initiatives, and then you find out that it's either money that's been assigned to something else, or it's been kicking around for years, or it just doesn't exist. So they said, oh, this will have a £40 million budget, which, as you know, within the context of the NHS is peanuts, but there was no £40 million budget, because the £40 million budget was almost entirely devoted to the ward housekeeping program. So there was really almost nothing to spend on food, on improving food. So that was a problem. There was no budget. Secondly, I was surprised that a lot of clinicians didn't really have that great an interest in improving hospital catering. I guess because, you know, in spite of the fact that Hippocrates, you know, who we supposedly have listened to, Hippocrates said food is medicine, but that seems to have been slightly forgotten by some people, you know, who think that drugs is medicine. They don't realize the importance of good nutrition in reducing antibiotic use, in reducing number of bed nights, in improving the general spiritual well-being and happiness of patients. So that was another problem. The third and most significant problem is was the churn of ministers. So during the 5 years that I was attempting to do this, I reported to 6 different ministers. So every time you got to the stage where you had finally persuaded a minister that it was actually a serious problem that needed to be addressed, hey, presto, oh, that minister gets moved and a new minister arrives. So the constant churn of ministers made it impossible to improve anything, to make lasting improvements. So the political will and the political consistency was lacking. And this is the most enormous tragedy, because even small improvements in hospital catering would produce huge improvements in patient welfare. So it is, I mean, I regard it as such a missed opportunity and such a foolish lack of political will and such a foolish lack of interest in patient well-being.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of foolish politicians around at the moment, but maybe the RSM can pick up the baton and bash it over the health minister's head. We've got a loyal supporter, Dr. Addy, almost always sends in a question. He's in Hull, I think. So he says, what would be on your menu for the NHS soup and shake weight loss plans? Because, you know, they are going to, amid all the COVID mayhem, they're going to try and persuade people to lose weight across the UK. I mean, specific diets for weight loss, you know, there was the Cambridge diet, which was around, it tasted horrible, I think. But, you know, what would be your recommendation for actually getting, we've got far too many overweight people in the UK, obviously.
Yeah, and you know, the pandemic has underlined the dangers of having a seriously overweight population. I wouldn't, you know, I'm not a nutritionist. I've sort of subscribed to the fact that every diet works, if only for a limited time. You know, we've had all these weird diets. We've had the grapefruit diet, the cabbage soup diet. You know, we might be having the soup and shake diet. The fundamentals of improving people's diets, I think, should begin with education, rather than with a prescriptive regime. We have a long way to go towards training people in the basics of good health. You know, we have this traffic light system now on foods, which can be very helpful. But, you know, on the other hand, I know well enough that, you know, if I want a packet of crisps, I can have a packet of crisps.
Yeah.
But I can only have it sort of once a week. I can't have a packet of crisps every day. So I think a lot of basic nutritional education at a primary school level is going to be the ultimate way of creating a long-lasting improvement in people's health.
Yeah, well, there's a question from Ivy Glavy. I think you pronounced that. Ivy wants to know what makes a good recipe book a bestseller. And she says, by the way, she loves your tomato and basil sauce. She's very keen on that.
Oh, what a good person she is. Well, you know, people have talked about the analogy between cooking and the old story of the eunuchs in the harem. And they used to say about the eunuchs in the harem that they knew everything about sex except how to do it. And to a certain extent, we see a population that reads cookbooks obsessively and loves reading cookbooks, but really is not cooking very much. Some cookery writers are just naturally great teachers. And, you know, one goes back, say, to Delia Smith, who, gosh, if you want to know how to boil an egg, and do it brilliantly and consistently, all you have to do is read Delia. There are other writers, much more in the tradition of, say, Elizabeth David, who are much more literary writers and write beautiful, evocative pieces about food. There is a lot of crossover between food writing and travel writing. Recipes from exotic places are always engaging. There are a lot of people, I mean, I know a lot of people who read cookbooks in bed. You know, a lot of people just read cookery books for pleasure. The standard of writing has consistently improved. And I think the standard of design and presentation of cookery books has consistently improved. There is, you know, the bestsellers always seem to be slightly divided between the ones that give you lots of good practical recipes and the ones that are more kind of aspirational. Mm-hmm. So there's an element of coffee table fashionability to some cookbooks. Some cookbooks never get near a kitchen. Other cookbooks are constantly spattered with gravy and boiling olive oil. So I think it is such a huge market, and there are so many different types of cookbooks. It's very difficult to say, gosh, these are the elements that make a cookbook work. Being on television for a lot of chefs certainly helps them sell a lot of cookbooks, but there are many chefs who haven't been on television who sell a lot of cookbooks as well.
Last question from the audience here on food before we better move on to arts and heritage, which I think probably I'm going to ask you which you're most proud of your achievements, so many achievements. But David Jones, he's a buddy of mine and a urologist out in Gloucester. He says, have you got any tips how to get a table in the inner sanctum at the Wolsey restaurant in Piccadilly? Maybe see there. Maybe seen you there.
I think the best thing is to go there a lot. and I mean, but it goes to the fact that I think it's very important to establish a relationship with a restaurant. Regulars are very important. If you like a restaurant, you should go there as often as you can. Regulars give a real sort of soul to a restaurant. Regulars will also be the ones who get the best tables, if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in getting. But it's really, you know, it's about developing a relationship, being respectful. I'm still astonished at how rude most people are to waiters and waitresses. You know, it's very important to realize that they are professionals. They're doing a tough job. They're not highly paid. They're bringing us a lot of joy, and we deserve to give them a great deal of respect.
Yeah, of course, you know, eat out to help out. Yeah, it's quite quite a good maxim. And somebody was saying, you know, if you are going to eat out, that you should eat out in these small individual private restaurants, not necessarily the chains, because the chains are going to be there at the end of this COVID mayhem, whilst the little restaurants really need the support of people. So I think that's a good message. So let's leave food, although I know you love your food, and that roast lamb, I can almost smell it down my computer that you're cooking up for you, probably with some nice red wine to go with it. I wouldn't be surprised. But no,
well, I know that. I mean, it's very interesting the number of very senior medical men and women who are astonishingly knowledgeable about claret.
Well, we work a lot with Jane McQuitty. She runs
he's brilliant.
Yeah, she knows a bit about wine, old Jane. And David Gleave, he runs
Yes.
Liberty Wines. Yeah, so they do some programs. In fact, I can give a plug since you've mentioned it. On the 1st of October and the subsequent Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, Jane McQuitty and David Gleave will be talking about some special French wines and some food from Chez Bruce to go with it, maps and paired wines and food.
Excellent.
Listen, we're running out of time, and I want to talk about arts and heritage because that, like restaurants, art and heritage is in crisis at the moment with the pandemic. So, I mean, you have done some amazing work to support not just British arts and heritage, but also Italian and down in Rome and your book again. So tell us a little bit about how you got into that. I mean, obviously the history of art at Cambridge, the PhD, but you're chairman on a whole load of arts boards, aren't you?
I mean, my principal kind of commitments at the moment is being chairman of the Royal Parks.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things the pandemic has kind of underlined is, or heightened, is the need for us to think about well-being, not just in medical terms. And that, you know, the health of the nation requires arts, it requires access to beauty, access to nature. You know, we have to be spiritually healthy as well as physically healthy. And the arts and heritage are that bit of the whole well-being package that has become so important over the last 6 months and that has often been neglected. We, you know, as a nation, we're very good at arts and heritage. Sometimes I think because we have so much good arts and heritage, we take it for granted. But the current crisis has shown us that we can't, because of course, a lot of museums and cultural institutions are having a terribly difficult time because there are no audiences. It's interesting thinking about the parks in particular, because that's what I've been spending so much of my time on. I was reading something written in the 1930s, which said that one of the great English innovations was regarding parks not just as places for a beautiful walk, but as a vital part of the health infrastructure. And we have seen over the last 6 months, especially during the period of the most intense lockdown, that people are crying out for access to nature. People are crying out for access to fresh air, access to beauty, access to space, in a way that enables them to be on a level playing field. Because, you know, we live in a relatively crowded island. Places like London, space is increasingly privatized, it's increasingly monitorized. The importance of open public realm in which people can be citizens and get together on an equal basis, it has never been more important. So I'm so proud of being able to work with the Royal Parks and, you know, to really make a major contribution to the well-being of everyone who lives in London or works in London or visits London.
Is that involve philanthropy, raising money for the parks, or
Yeah, because the parks, I mean, like most central government funded cultural and heritage organizations, the parks for the last 20 years have had their government, rather like, you know, museums, the Opera House, etc. government funding has been declining. And, you know, I can understand that because there are huge demands for funds for the health service, for security, for social care. And over the last 20 years, the cultural and heritage institutions have done a brilliant job of being able to earn more of their income. So, for example, you know, the Royal Parks, you know, 80% of our costs we earn. We don't rely on big government handouts. But when the commercial activities collapse, then there's a need for government to step in with more funding. I'm very pleased with the steps the government have taken thus far, but looking at the vast number of museums and galleries and orchestras and theaters that need government support at this terrible time, one is ever hopeful that the message will get through to politicians that the arts and culture and heritage are vital for the national well-being, as well as for our national prosperity, because they're part of what define Britain. They're part of what gives Britain, you know, we're always number one or number two in the world table of soft power. And one of the ways we exercise our soft power is through the arts and culture and heritage. It's hugely important for everyone in this country.
Yeah. And I suppose COVID, you know, drove people into the parks in a way. I certainly, you know, I live not far from Richmond Park.
Yeah.
I just love Richmond Park, and walking around there, you know, it was teeming with people, and they banned the cyclists for a while, which a lot of the walkers really liked. People got off their bikes literally, and they were walking. It was fantastic, and of course the weather was good. And I think you got to practice on your guitar a bit during the lockdown as well.
Yes, yeah, I most certainly did. I mean, one of the things that was happening during the lockdown, which was a very sort of frightening moment, was suddenly a couple of local authorities closed their parks. The National Trust closed their sort of parks and gardens. And we were determined that the Royal Parks were not going to close. We were not going to close because we could never allow ourselves to live in a society where it was only the rich and the privileged that had access to open space. So we really fought hard in spite of, you know, a sort of precipitous, catastrophic decline in our income. We decided that we were going to keep the parks open and we were going to keep them up to the high standards that we've maintained. And I think the public benefited hugely from that. And our example, I think, helped encourage other people to keep their parks open as well.
That's great. Actually, there's a question which takes me back to your book from Danny Rosenbaum. He says, can you tell us a little bit more about the book? I'm just holding it up there to the screen.
Yeah.
Were there any particular interesting research moments? I mean, if you look at the front cover, that elephant has the most curious expression on its face.
Well,
yeah, tell us a bit about that, and tell us a bit more about the research.
I'll do it very quickly. The elephant is the work of a sculptor and architect called Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Bernini lived at the same time roughly as Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Van Dyck, yet even Velázquez, even amongst that stellar company, he was regarded by his contemporaries as by far the greatest artist in Europe. And he also had the greatest patron in Europe, namely the Pope. Now, I think people have to remember that in the 17th century, the Pope was not just a spiritual leader. The Pope was the sovereign of a secular state. The papal states were extraordinarily important in Europe. The papacy was an incredibly rich prize, which is why you had enormously ambitious and competitive people like the Borgias and the Medicis all competing to make one of their family the Pope, because the papacy was a gravy train. The papacy needed great artists because propaganda was very important. The papacy was fighting a pretty desperate struggle for confessional mastery in Europe. because the Reformation had been quite a blow to the Catholic Church, and this sort of combat for the souls of Europe culminated in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Europe was torn apart in a cataclysm that was unequaled until the Great War of 1914-18. Pope Alexander VII emerged from the wreckage of the 30 Years' War. He came to be Pope at a time when the Catholic Church was losing power. And he virtually invented the concept of soft power. He said, actually, you know something? We may be less politically influential than we used to be, but I'm going to make Rome the most beautiful, most modern, most enchanting city in the world. I'm going to recruit Europe's greatest artist, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and every person of any significance is going to want to come to Rome once they see what we're doing. So Bernini and Pope Alexander VII formed the greatest artistic double act in history and created much of the beauties of Rome, which for everyone, I think, still remains the eternal city, a great example of how beautiful and inspirational and spiritually satisfying a city can be.
Yeah, that's pretty much, you just told us the story of your book, and I did love all the diagrams and the pictures in there. I was just thinking it would make a great TV series. I don't know if you're watching Simon Sharma's thing on the Romantics at the moment.
Yeah, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I think yours would be. So if I were the Beeb, I would get onto this and offer you a contract. Lloyd, we have to finish because your lamb is going to be overcooked. I'm pleased to say that when I did the interview for Michael Palin, his wife set fire to the cooking and the fire alarm went off. But your wife obviously has kept.
We've had no fire alarms.
Yeah, we better thank her for that. But listen, thank you so much. It's so interesting. Actually, we could have continued this conversation for at least another hour. So just a couple of announcements. Firstly, tomorrow we got Nazreen, Carolyn, and Alistair talking about long COVID, big problem. This prolonged symptoms from COVID and how you deal with that. We'll be talking about that tomorrow lunchtime. And next week we've got a very famous doctor from Boston, Massachusetts, Don Berwick. He's kind of the patron saint of patient safety, and he's doing the In Conversation again with me. Simon Wesley, by the way, has sent his best wishes from the South Coast, our previous immediate past president. He's rather wet and cold, having been cycling in the rain all day. So thank you from me. Thank you for our audience. Please remember that the RSM is under the cosh at the moment because our building's closed and we're having to run the show without any income. So anybody who's enjoyed listening to this story of Rome and story of sources and royal parks, please do make a donation to the Royal Society of Medicine to keep us afloat until COVID is over. So thanks, Lloyd. Thanks the audience. Thank you for sending in the questions. Thanks, Maddie and the team for running the show, and enjoy your lamb.
Thank you, Roger. Good night. Bye.